Hi, this is Professor Enriquez with Chapter 4 summary. I'm going to be working on carbohydrates today. This is the first of three chapters that it covers the macromolecules that our body depends on for energy, and carbohydrates in particular are very important for our body's energy supply, but they're important for a lot of other things as well, so we're going to see how that all works today. So we're going to talk about the structure of carbohydrates, start with simple carbohydrates, and then go to complex carbohydrates. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they're digested, how they're broken down and processed in the body. I'm going to talk about how the quantity of carbohydrates in our blood is regulated, which is really important. We're going to see why. And finally, talk a little bit about how carbohydrates relate to our food, our diet, including sweeteners. Okay, so first up, when we say the word carbohydrate, what we're talking about is one or more of these rings of sugar. You can see, or what it is, it's the 6 carbons, normally carbohydrates that are in our body that are the regular energy carrying kind, are 6 carbons bonded together covalently along with a bunch of oxygens and hydrogens. And one of these rings is what's called a monosaccharide. And so you can see that this on the right hand side, there's a picture of a glucose molecule. The vertices, each vertex where each line meets each other line is where there's a carbon there. So that if you can count, there's 6 carbons, including the CH2OH at the end. And so that's glucose molecule. Now there's several different kinds of monosaccharides. Glucose is the one that our body uses, but fructose and galactose are also similar sort of sugar molecules made of 6 carbons that form a ring. They're just different arrangements of the oxygen, and the bonds are a little different. But each one can be converted into the others, and in fact, we're going to see later why that's important. But basically, the upshot is that glucose is the version of this molecule that it belongs in our blood, that provides energy to all of our cells. Our cells actually absorb the glucose from our blood and break it apart in order to make the energy molecule, ATP. And then they release those carbons, those 6 carbons from each glucose, become carbon dioxide, which is what we're breathing out. And so notice that we breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. Where does the carbon come from? Well, it comes from the sugar that we eat, especially glucose. And so the word simple carbohydrate is often associated with the word sugar, because this individual sugar molecule, this monosaccharide, is just 6 carbons in a little ring. But the word sugar is not as precise as the word monosaccharide. And so a simple carbohydrate kind of encapsulates both monosaccharides and also what we call disaccharides. And then I have here a picture of a disaccharide on the bottom part. The disaccharide is 2 sugar molecules, 2 individual monosaccharides bonded together with a covalent bond. And so there's many different kinds of disaccharides. 2 common ones are lactose, which is in milk. It's milk, it's also called milk sugar, and sucrose, which is also called table sugar. That's the kind of sugar that they always put out in restaurants for you to put in your drink or whatever. So now notice that lactose and sucrose, as the disaccharides, they have to be broken apart when we eat them, and they are. It's a fairly simple job to break apart lactose into its component sugar rings, which are monosaccharide rings, which in the case of lactose would be a glucose and a galactose molecule. And so sucrose is a glucose and a fructose bonded together. And then maltose, for example, is 2 glucose molecules bonded together. There's a lot of other examples, but you'll see those are the most common ones. So simple carbohydrates is another word for sugar. Complex carbohydrates come in kind of two versions of complex carbohydrates, but basically they're the same idea. They're both the 6 carbon sugar rings that are bonded to each other. And so those can be bonded in different ways. So for example, there are some, and we call them polysaccharides if there's more than 2 individual monosaccharides bonded together to make a chain. Some polysaccharides are what we say digestible, meaning we have the enzymes to break them apart into monosaccharides. And remember, since we can only absorb monosaccharides and we can only use monosaccharides in our cells for energy, the polysaccharides that are digestible are a food source for us. And so we call those starches. So glycogen is a starch. There's other starches that are in many plants, like especially often plants use them for energy storage as well. So you'll see like the tubers, like potatoes, that's full of starch. Rice and wheat are the little part of the seed that's meant to nourish the little seed once it sprouts. So those are also full of starch. Um, and then in our own bodies, we store a starch called glycogen, which we're going to see later. Those are all digestible, meaning they're meant to come apart into individual monosaccharides. There's other polysaccharides that are not meant to come apart, and you can see in the bottom corner there's a diagram of cellulose, and cellulose is it's the same glucose molecules, but they're bonded to each other in a way that they don't come apart. There's no one enzyme that can just chew that up like there is with glycogen. Now, cellulose can be digested if you work at it hard enough. Now, not us humans, we can't digest it. That cellulose, for example, is a common ingredient in grass, and we don't eat grass. Cows eat grass. That's why they have four stomachs, because they digest and digest and digest, and slowly but surely they can break it apart. But we don't. When we eat grass, you don't expect to digest it for energy. It doesn't have anything that our body can use. So when you have a polysaccharide that's indigestible, we call it fiber. And fiber actually passes through our digestive system without being broken down. But as I mentioned in chapter 3, that's a good thing. You actually want to have fiber in your diet because it traps water, and it also traps bile salts. It actually traps cholesterol in it. And so it's shown that high fiber diets tend to lower your blood cholesterol overall, which is a good thing because many of us have a problem with having lots of cholesterol and you're kicking your arteries and so forth. So monosaccharides are an energy source. Polysaccharides may come in one or two varieties, the kind that's meant to break down into an energy source, or the kind that's not, and it ends up passing through our digestive system. So when we take in food, we have to understand how it's broken down. Now, I want to reiterate, monosaccharides are already in the fully broken down form. For example, you can take grape juice. Grape sugar is basically pure glucose. Grapes just have a lot of glucose in them. And since it's not a disaccharide or a polysaccharide, it's a monosaccharide, it doesn't need to be digested. You don't actually need to break it apart or anything. It's already ready as is to be absorbed into your through this lining of your small intestine. On the other hand, if you look at something with a lot of sucrose in it, like cane sugar, right? This comes from sugar cane. That's sucrose, so that needs to be broken apart. And if you eat rice or potatoes or wheat or anything, you'll actually have to break that down all the way. First, by breaking it down into smaller and smaller chains of polysaccharides, and then finally into monosaccharides before you can absorb it. And that process starts in the mouth because your mouth secretes what's called salivary amylase, meaning it's an amylase, an enzyme that's in your saliva, and that actually breaks down starch. And in fact, if you're ever bored and you can just take a piece of bread and just chew it and chew it and chew it and chew it, you'll find it actually starts tasting sweet after a while because your mouth's salivary amylase, secreted from your saliva, will break apart the polysaccharides down into monosaccharides bit by bit. The pancreas also secretes another amylase, and that further digests the polysaccharides until they're basically down to disaccharides, and then the intestinal lining, actual brush border enzymes of your small intestine will finish breaking down disaccharides into monosaccharides. And so once you have monosaccharides, and then again, reminder, monosaccharides is glucose, galactose, and fructose. Those are individual single sugar rings. Those can be absorbed through the lining of the small intestine. They pass into the blood. That blood does not go to the whole body right away, because if it did, your blood sugar would be very high. Now remember, carbohydrates are hydrophilic. You might remember that from the chemistry we already talked about. The chemistry of molecules says that things that are hydrophilic have a lot of intermolecular forces. So that means they're sticky. And this should make sense because honey, think about syrup, think about if you ever seen in a middle school, they spill soda and let it dry on the floor and it always gets really sticky, right? It's got a lot of sugar because sugar is sticky. And so monosaccharides, you don't want to have too much of it in the blood because it'll make that blood really sticky, make it like a syrup. And so that blood being absorbed from the small intestine goes directly to the liver. The liver will do two things. It'll store most of the monosaccharides, and it'll also convert fructose and galactose to glucose, because glucose is the molecule, the sugar molecule that our cells actually absorb and break down and use. And so that means that only glucose is useful. And so most of these glucose molecules are stored as glycogen. So on the bottom right, I have a diagram showing a small protein structure. That's the little colorful thing. And then around it, you'll see all these very small rings. These are all carbohydrate rings. They're all attached to each other. It's meant to be that way. It's meant to come apart when you need it. That's the whole idea of glycogen. That's a starch that's stored in our liver. It's a temporarily stored form of glucose. It breaks apart as you need it. And when we need it is when our blood glucose gets low. So we have to maintain a homeostasis of blood sugar. You have to have the right amount because, as I suggested, if your blood sugar gets too high, your blood can increase viscosity, can turn into syrup. If your blood sugar gets too low, then you end up not having enough energy for all your cells to operate, and you actually find that people who are what's called hypoglycemic, where their blood sugar gets very low, they get headaches, they get cranky, and all of a sudden they just pass out, and then you'll coma and die because your blood sugar has to be high enough to operate on your brain cells. Your brain cells cannot store energy. There's no stored glycogen in your brain like there is in your muscles, so it has to be provided fresh constantly. This is why there's so much blood going through your neck. So the liver stores carbohydrates and it releases them from the glycogen when your blood sugar gets low. And also, when your blood sugar is high, your liver absorbs most of the excess carbohydrates, the glucose molecules, and stores them again as glycogen. So there's two hormones that are secreted that regulate the amount of activity, each of these activities the liver can perform. And these hormones are called insulin and glucagon. Now, you've probably heard of insulin. Insulin is one of the hormones that's secreted. It's secreted when your blood sugar is high. So normally when you're eating food and immediately after you've eaten food, your insulin levels from your pancreas, your pancreas secretes more insulin, your insulin levels rise because your food is being broken down and going into your blood. And if you fail to secrete insulin properly, or if your cells don't respond to insulin properly, we call that diabetes, meaning that your blood sugar goes really high when you eat. And that can be very dangerous because, as I suggested, the amount of sugar in your blood can really if you don't know how bad it is to have high blood sugar, ask someone who has diabetes what it's like to have their blood sugar go really high and they feel really awful. You can actually lose fingers, you can actually lose eyes because all of that syrup clogs up small capillaries, all kinds of bad stuff. So that's the pancreas detecting how much sugar there is, releasing insulin when your blood sugar is high. When your blood sugar is low, the pancreas secretes glucagon instead, and glucagon stimulates your liver to break down glycogen down into glucose. It also causes the liver to perform what's called gluconeogenesis, which is the conversion of fat and protein to carbs, which is a very important process to do. Well, obviously, fat is a great energy storage molecule, but it can't. Most of your cells can't actually break down fat directly for energy. Your muscle cells can, but the rest of your body actually needs glucose. It's got to have glucose, and so especially your brain, which is the star of the show. So your liver has to take that fat, break it apart into carbohydrates, and it can do that. It will, especially if you haven't eaten in a while. So if you are unable to build up a reserve of fat and glycogen, you will need to eat constantly, right? And there's actually a woman, I should have put a picture of her, I didn't think of it, but you can Google her. There's a woman in England who has a disorder where she can't produce fat, that she's missing the enzyme to produce fat, and she's very, very skinny, and she's disfigured, and she has to eat basically every hour or else she'll die, because after about an hour of not eating, we tend to start performing gluconeogenesis and producing carbohydrates from our fat tissue. So the last thing I want to talk about is our diet and how carbohydrates relate to our diet. This is a very large portion of the book. I don't want to rehash the whole thing. But I want to mention that there's a lot of fad diets out there and try and restrict your carbs. A lot of people who don't do their research, they just say, oh, I'm just going to go off carbs because they're fattening. And there's a very grim lack of understanding of how important fat is to our health. As I just mentioned, that and I understand if you're 5'5" and you're 400 pounds, you definitely have a lot of fat that you shouldn't have on your body. But a lot of people try and lose weight and they cut carbs, and this forces an increase in the process of gluconeogenesis, which is converting protein and fat to carbs, assuming they're getting enough food, which often they're not. Also, is a separate problem. A lot of these fat diets are very unhealthy for you because you have to have a certain amount of carbs. If you eat only protein, fat, and you completely cut out all carbs, you can actually get what's called ketoacidosis, where your body actually produces a lot of acid by in the process of performing this gluconeogenesis. These ketone bodies are acidic, and they can end up you can end up getting very sick because of this. So you have to make sure you're getting. So it's easier to just eat carbs, much easier. And in fact, carbs are really important. Now it's the processed sugars that are most dangerous. Whole grain wheat breads and potatoes and rice. I mean, people with diabetes have to avoid these carbohydrate-rich foods, but most body normal people benefit greatly from eating complex carbohydrates because they break down relatively slowly, especially whole wheat, things with a lot of fiber. It breaks down more slowly. You release the carbohydrates into your body more slowly. You don't go through this sugar, insulin spike, insulin crash issue that a lot of people get when they eat a lot of processed sugars. And so there's a lot of well-balanced diets. There's a lot of different kinds of them. You'll see some involve cutting or restricting carbohydrates, but really the most important thing is to cut processed sugars. Cutting all carbohydrates may or may not work for you, but it definitely can be hard on your body. The last thing I want to mention is that carbohydrates are often used as sweeteners. And so, for example, high fructose corn syrup is the most common sweetener used in the US right now. It's basically glucose. It's basically corn sugar glucose that's been treated with an enzyme to convert some of it to fructose. And fructose is sweeter than glucose, which is why they do this. It's also thought to be a good thing in that it doesn't spike your insulin. Fructose doesn't spike your insulin like glucose does. But the downside is that they put a lot of it in most of these foods, these sweet foods like candies and sodas and so forth. And so this processed sugar just ends up gumming up your system. You end up having a lot of carbohydrates. And so there's a lot of research out there on different kinds of nutritive and non-nutritive sweeteners. The idea often is to either have a nutritive sweetener, which is something like honey or maple syrup, which is basically sugar in a different form. It may have a lot of fructose in there, things like that. And it's supposed to be as sweet or sweeter than cane sugar, but it still has calories. You'll actually look and it has a certain number, same number of calories or whatever as sugar, that quantity of sugar would have. That's different from a non-nutritive sweetener. So a non-nutritive sweetener is a chemical that doesn't provide any calories. So that would be aspartame, Splenda, stevia. These are some examples I've given here. Sweet and low is saccharin. I believe that's another one. The non-nutritive sweeteners are 0 calories because either the amount of calories they actually have are very, very small, or because they can't be absorbed at all by the body and they pass directly through. People are often afraid of non-nutritive sweeteners because they think they cause cancer. The American Cancer Society has investigated all of them and hasn't found any link to any of these to cancer or to any other major health problem. So people are often now. So of course, some people also say they don't taste right. They don't taste as good, which is fine. I'm not going to argue that everyone has a different taste profile because of the receptors in our taste buds. So if you don't like these, that's okay. But they're not dangerous for you. And in fact, if you use these instead of sugar or honey, you are reducing your. Well, honey's not really, it doesn't spike your insulin as much. It's really the processed sugar that is the worst one as far as spiking your insulin. So just putting that option out there. And I know someone who, of course, is allergic to all the non-nutritive sweeteners. So lucky him. So everyone's body is different. Your most important job is to learn your own and understand how your body's metabolism operates. Okay, so that's it for Chapter 4 for carbohydrates. I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you again soon.